think it's worth trying to think a little bit about how is product development different in a startup. Now, these are not absolutes, and it is uh, hard to make absolutely bright line distinctions because, in fact, we do want to leverage what we've learned in prior jobs, in prior organizations, in prior problem solving. But we also want to take advantage of the unique creative energy, the unique absence of legacy, and the need to really push the envelope in at least one dimension beyond where it has been before. So established organizations have established products, established customers, established procedures. There's a way of doing things which has turned out to work at least pretty well. Now, sometimes those existing procedures and existing code bases have already gotten stale at the big organization. And a classic problem of big organizations is that they're trying to do, current state-of-the-art design in infrastructures or on code bases that were developed 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so there's already this problem of being held down by the past. You also inevitably have tech debt. What is tech debt? Tech debt is the recognition that the way you're doing things is not as good as it could be. That in fact, you recognize that you should be using a different set of tools. You should be having a different product organization, that there are available algorithms and software technologies that you should be using, but you haven't gotten there yet because transitions in a big organization are hard because you have such a large history that you have to figure out how to drag forward. You do have a lot of polished, proven methods that you've established a set of quality metrics that work with your customers. You have a definition of what is a release, what is the product, which has been proven by market success. And you have this inevitable phenomenon that while every established organization is building new product, it's always competing for resources and management attention with existing products, either incremental improvements to those existing products or just simple maintenance, operational maintenance of the existing product. And you have an organization structure and an assignment of roles within that organization, which has evolved over time in response to the skills of that organization and in response to what this team is trying to do with this product line. In a startup, on the other hand, you don't have legacy. And it is, first of all, enormously liberating. There's nothing quite so much fun or as stressful as that initial product development, where you're starting from a clean sheet of paper. You have some initial vision of what you're trying to do, and you're running as fast as hell to get there. And you can run pretty fast. If you use metrics of sort of how much product, how much code, how much hardware was designed during that first 3 months or 6 months or a year, it's staggering compared to what the same number of people can typically do in an established company. Partly motivation, partly lack of legacy. You need to figure out what is the essential infrastructure you need to put in place in order to be able to build it, and build it to support both the productivity you want and the quality you want. There is an open question about what are the metrics of quality that matter for a new product. Certainly, there are classic metrics that you have. You don't want software that doesn't do what it's intended. You don't want software that crashes. You don't want um, hardware bugs that lead to gross unpredictability and non-functionality in it. But quality is more than just the absence of bugs. It is also compliance to the behavior that the customer expects and needs, which is um, which has got more dimensions to it than just an absence of bugs. And because you're still exploring what the customer wants and needs and what is useful, you are still exploring what does viable quality look like. And that's part of the discovery process of the early development and the early customer engagements. Initially, you often have a team of generalists. You need people who are able to do a wide variety of things because you don't know initially what needs to be done. And so you need people who will say, oh, okay, I'll jump in and do that. So your hardware architect may end up writing a lot of code. Your software developer may end up designing logic. Your uh, your uh, your lead programmer may be building a lot of infrastructure. It will evolve over time. As the development team grows, then more specialization becomes possible, but also the need for clear roles will evolve as the product goes into use, as it becomes mission critical for customers. You will need to have some response mechanisms. Who's building the next product? Who's supporting this product? What happens when a bug is reported? How do you jump into action? And in the very early days, the answer can be, well, everybody jumps into action. When you have uh, more mission critical customers, and as you have more people in the organization, you'll have to come up with some more structure for crisis response as well. And the startup has great need for agility because you don't know initially what the whole product is. You're going to discover that. And people will be building different parts of the whole product in parallel and in response to this customer discovery of what the whole product needs to be. The core product, the core technology may be the same across many different possible customer engagements and customer roles, but the other parts of the product, what are the partner products that are used with it? What's the documentation and training? What is the user interface? May change a lot as you do this. I mean, a classic example in Babel Labs, for example, would be we developed a core algorithm. The algorithm didn't change as the product evolved from a cloud service that ran the core model combined with a phone-based GUI that captured and managed audio and video clips sent to the cloud to something where it became a library running on a Qualcomm Hexagon DSP as a module of embedded software. Very different manifestations of what was essentially the same core technology. So one of the central things that you do, particularly when you're thinking as a manager.
Chris, can I ask a question or a comment on
Yeah,
that
yeah,
question?
yeah, sure, by all means.
So one thing that I think would be good to call out is different constraints between a large enterprise and a startup, right?
Yeah,
And that also affects the various freedoms that people have in the teams, right?
yeah.
In a startup, you're constrained by, say, budget or number of people working on something. And so you may look to automate more of the processes because you don't have more people to hand things off to. Whereas in an established organization, some of the stuff that we go through at Cisco is there's constraints on like our flexibility to be able to adopt new technology as quickly because it needs to be evaluated by either our central security organization or things like that. And so I think that like that really comes into play in just how you think about the product development life cycles between a larger organization and a startup. And then
Yeah.
mid-sized companies fall somewhere in between as to what their processes gate and how that affects just their thought process on picking up new tools and innovating around those areas.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. And you've lived it real time. I mean, I think you've managed an organization of what, 1,000 software developers or something like that. So you know all about existing company infrastructure and capabilities and bureaucracies. The and I think it's also worth highlighting a one critical consideration. I certainly think that one of the enormous advantages of a startup company is they have very high communication bandwidth within that small team. Partly because it is so small that have a handful of people who can talk regularly. I think it can really be a significant problem if you were to try and take that startup team and say, we're going to put half that team in one time zone and half that team, you know, 9 or 12 time zones away, such that we're cutting that bandwidth of communication way down. Part of the way that big companies evolve their engineering is they become more compartmentalized. They put teams in different locations, and they're kind of consciously becoming less dependent on high bandwidth communication between people. They are building more modularity such that inside of a sub team, there may be very high communication. Inside of one Scrum team, there may be great bandwidth, but there's a modularization and a formalization of interfaces between groups such that they don't have to communicate constantly all day long. And it's just a function of scale, of size of organization. And I think, and it's made even more emphatic by the physical distribution of groups. It's part of the reason why I'm an advocate that the core engineering team of a startup really wants to be in the same or similar time zones at least. And there is significant advantages in having those teams physically together. Now people do manage to build new products with teams on opposite sides of the world collaborating together, but it's harder. It means that some of those people are spending a lot of their working days outside of their normal uh, time zone working periods. But you need that very high bandwidth to get the advantage and to keep from creating formalized bureaucratic handoffs, which are in a sense means to deal with the fact that you don't have a lot of bandwidth between groups. You want high bandwidth between groups, and you want to rely on having high bandwidth between team members in the early days. That was a great comment. Thank you. The roadmap is certainly uh, a critical thing. And I think everybody understands the general role of roadmaps. I think it's worth highlighting that it is not just a planning tool. Um, it's not just a tool for communicating with outside parties. Outside parties might be product management, finance, sales, but also customers. But it's also a tool for inspiring the team. And I'm certainly a believer that uh, rallying a very strong intellectual group, often diverse, high powered, certainly in my experience, idiosyncratic and opinionated, is really critical. You want those high octane individuals in the team, and you want them to have uh, a common mission, which is reasonably hard And so rallying people around this very difficult, just barely doable goal uh, is critically important, and the roadmap plays a role there. I would argue that tech debt is an inevitable part of ambition, and it's not always bad. At least let me express the flip side of it. If you're achieving everything in your plan, if you're building all of the infrastructure that you need to do it, then your plan may be too modest. You may not be pushing the envelope enough. You may be not trying enough if some things have to get left behind. If you're achieving all of your priorities, couldn't you have pushed harder? Couldn't you have tried something even more ambitious? And so the ambition that you have is needs to be pretty pretty passionate, and it's driven by this interesting mix of technology potential and customer needs. Uh, One of the pitfalls for many organizations is that they develop their own oversimplified model of what the customer needs. And I think it's inevitable. I certainly fall prey to it all the time in thinking about what I'm building, because it's so much easier for me to imagine what the customer needs than to actually go and talk to the customer. And even when you talk to customers, you have to do a lot of filtering. Back to the old Henry Ford, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have told me a faster horse. Uh, but you've got these two different pressures at work, and how you balance those depends a lot on the kind of product you're building, how much you're really forced to fit into making a incremental improvement in the customer's life, or are you really aspiring to create what amounts to a new product category? As you build a roadmap, I think it's important to be super clear with in leadership, in the engineering organization, in overall between product managers who are thinking about the market mission and the developers who are thinking about how to build it, on what programs are really funded and active. People may have side projects. They may be doing little explorations of things at the extreme of feasibility. Just because you're working on something on the side doesn't mean that everybody else is aligned with it. It doesn't mean you're going to offer it to customers. And people need to be very clear about what is in and out at a given moment. Now, that may change. If your side project does show some huge potential, especially in combination with your plan of record looking like it's going to fall flat, you may make a pivot. But until there is a clear decision to make a pivot, you have to acknowledge that there are some programs that are in and some that are out. It's also really imperative to have a unified view of what the delivery milestones and resources are. There's always a question that comes up about whether you pad those schedules for external consumption. Do you give your customer a later date for delivery than what you have internally? And you can go either way. It really depends on how sophisticated and mature the engineering organization is with the way that they're figuring out what their internal schedules are. The one thing which is absolutely unacceptable is giving the customer a date which is earlier than the one you have in engineering, because you're just setting yourself up for failure. You may not want to disappoint a customer, but the truth will come out. Whether you tell the customer exactly the date you're using internally, or you add some margin for inevitable delays, what you may think are inevitable delays is a stylistic choice. Um, you need to be super clear on what's promised to customers and not just what you said to them, but what they acknowledged, what they fed back about what they heard. So finding ways to discover what customers thought they were getting, not just what you put on your PowerPoint slides, is really valuable. And to be clear, sometimes you do speak about directions you could go or features that you might develop. But it's really important to be clear with customers and clear with yourself about what's on that wish list or that future work and what's actually in the product in, delivery 1.6. So you have this product planning and engineering tangle at the center with these two fundamental forces that we've talked about a bunch of times, and really customers come at it first from the standpoint of what are their current problems, and technology is often driven by a vision of how those problems are going to be solved in the future, and most especially what are the emerging problems that will come out of the 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 evolution of the underlying technologies and capabilities or the transitions of customers to newer workflows and activities. The feature list is really about managing information. There's always a question of what's the definition of the product concept, which is kind of the big picture, and then what is the definition of the exact manifestation of that in a precise release. I have come to appreciate the model of the product manager who is knowledgeable about the building of the product, but is not a product builder themselves. They are really a piece of the transmission, a key piece of gearing that is in place between the motor and the wheels. If the wheels are the sales customer engagement and the motor is engineering, then the product manager is all of that gearing, which translates that engineering power into something that's actually useful on the road. The product team are the people who understand the business strategy. They understand something about what the technology can and can't do. They couldn't build it themselves. And they are, especially over time, a critical part of talking to the customers about the product. Now, of course, in the earliest days, there isn't a product team. The product team is the CEO and the CTO, and then it becomes maybe a product leader and the VP of engineering who are also in that conversation. But over time, it likely becomes a separate organization. Engineering over time takes on a role which is more about how the underlying technology can be built into something. So they understand the the underlying technology well, and they may be the only people who really understand the intimate details of the feature. And so there's a lot of translation that's taking place between these different languages of of product needs in the customer versus technology mechanisms in the engineering process. Software is very engineer driven. There are certainly some parts of the software that users can understand. They talk about, where are the menus, where are the buttons, but often there is a pretty high degree of mystery about what's really going on, that even very sophisticated product managers and marketing people and salespeople and management aren't going to be familiar with. That when you talk about, you know, a whole strategy of using Kalman filters for speech enhancement, just to take one example, we really can't and don't expect anybody up the chain to understand the mathematics of Kalman filters. It may be really important to the behavior of the product, but it's going to remain largely a mystery to the rest of the organization. And so we're going to rely on the engineering team to understand the trade-offs well about these major architectural decisions. And we won't necessarily be able to translate it all. Though, as an aside, it may be quite important to find ways to oversimplify the choices as tools to establishing differentiation when you talk about the productization, the marketing, the discussion of benefits and impact with customers. And of course, none of this is absolute. It's always a conversation among the different people and eventually different organizations in the team. There's a joint decision process about how you do things. There's a joint decision process of how much we're driven from customer requirements in versus technology potential out. And the name of the agreement is a plan of record and a schedule. And having that should allow lots of degrees of freedom in how the plan of record is achieved, because the plan of record can't get into the details about every specific function that gets implemented. But having a process by which everyone knows, everyone agrees, and everyone works towards a single plan is clearly critically important. So that to me is encapsulates some of the key dynamics, especially in the early days. Now, it shouldn't sound wildly different from product development in a large organization, because it is a reflection of that fundamental intellectual process of building stuff. But because it's done with many fewer people and it's done with greater constraints on resources and fewer constraints on method, you have, I think, a different way that the game gets played. So let's take a pause there, because I think it's there's a lot here that is both familiar and subtly disruptive, perhaps, to the way that you may have worked in large organizations.